Let's start with Genesis 11, 4-9. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they now propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. Now, I'm not mad. I know that's a really weird way to start to talk about UX and information architecture, but there are a few good reasons why that's there at the beginning of this talk. The first one is that I did a version of this talk earlier in the year, and I used the phrase 21st century towers of Babel to talk about some of the digital places that I'd seen and helped build. They're kind of magnificent vertical structures that, while internally coherent, they don't link very well, they don't communicate well, and so they miss opportunities. And so I'm going to use that phrase later. I wanted to go back to the source and introduce that metaphor properly. Here's a picture of the Tower of Babel. That's what it looks like. And this is the second reason why that's there at the beginning, because communication is hard. Sometimes the projects that we're involved in feel a bit like this. You're like staring at the heavens, pulling out your hair, wondering what went wrong. And that's because communication is difficult. Sometimes we lack a common vocabulary when we're endeavoring to create what we want to create. And the third reason is that the story of the Tower of Babel, is an etiological tale or an origin story. And origins aren't just cool if you're a superhero or a reality TV contestant. They're interesting and they're powerful because origins set us off on a path. They can constrain the direction that we travel into the future. They sort of define what's possible, or at least suggest what's possible to us. And that's really, those three things are what this talk is all about. It's about the structural concerns of UX design. It's a bit about information architecture. And it's about the practical concerns of UX design. So I'll talk a bit about communication and the challenges of communication. And then at the end, I'll talk about temporal design and considering time in UX. And I'll probably also, I think, really this talks about sort of stories, the power of stories to tie things together, to synthesize knowledge and to build connections. It's 45 minutes long, which is a very long time to listen to me, I realize, especially at the end of the day. So I've broken it up into those three sections, really. I'll start by talking about things and spaces and those Babel-like structures. And then I'll move on to talking about invisible stuff. I'll talk about trying to shift perspective and build consensus. I'll basically spend about 10 minutes talking about flow diagrams. And then I'll talk about a practical technique we've been using to consider time and experience, not just the structures and spaces that contain those experiences. I've got 3 jokes, but 2 of them are very difficult to spot, so don't feel under any pressure to laugh. I probably won't have time for questions, but I will be trying to answer them via Show Gizmo, so if you have questions or anything isn't clear, please stick it down there. So I'll start with an origin story and a definition so that I can talk a bit about what I think information architecture is. Because I'm the creative director of user experience architecture, and I've been doing some thinking about what information architecture is. And I think I know what it isn't. Information architecture isn't just organizing things. I think over recent years, regardless of your specialism or your job title, I think we've all inherited some more responsibility for information architecture. But back when I started doing it, I thought this was a pretty good definition of information architecture, a place for everything and everything in its place. It's got like loads of words that we care about as information architects. It talks about places, and information architects are definitely interested in placemaking. We make places out of information. It also talks about things, and it suggests that by thinking about those things, you'll have a better sense of the place or places where that thing might belong. And it's that relationship between things and places that has sort of changed the way I think about information architecture. Because things are different these days. It used to be that you could take a thing, put it on a shelf, and the world was a little more organized. And we carried forward that sort of philosophy into information architecture. We made places and we put things in them. And information architecture was focused on that kind of organization. And it works fine for some types of things and some types of places. In the physical world, a physical thing can only live in one place at a time. And in the past, places were simpler too. A place could only be in one place at a time. Smaller places could only be contained by bigger places. The TARDIS didn't really make any sense in the past where it was invented. In fact, if we think about the past of the BBC, back to 1963 when we invented Doctor Who and his TARDIS, back to 1922, our first broadcasts, although the things we had to organize had the whiff of the immaterial about them, they were broadcast signals transmitted over the air. We still organized them in fairly traditional ways, the same ways that we'd probably organize physical things. We collected them into lists. We had a broadcast signal and a time and a schedule, a probably non-physical thing, but a single space that we slotted it into. And as IA's evolved, I think we've probably carried that idea forward. We've built places and put things in them. And most of the time it's been sort of tree-like structures. We've experimented and built different kind of structures, but that's really what we've been doing a lot of the time as information architects. I wasn't around for it, but back when the BBC first got online in 1997, I imagine that's how we organized it. We had a few pages, we built a single self-contained ecosystem for the BBC online. But since then, things have changed. We now make things out of times and channels and smaller places. They're a mix of data and noise and information. We build things for about news and cultural events and sporting events. We deliver experiences to 35 million unique devices every week. We're the third biggest website in the UK and the only British website in the top 10. We publish 1,500 URLs every day. And it's that sort of scale of opportunity that means we've created many more things and very many more places. And things are different these days, as are the places that contain them. Information architecture isn't just the science of separation, winnowing down categories to move users progressively onwards. Onwards isn't straightforward either anymore. Journeys aren't just flowing from top to bottom. They're kind of wiggly and squiggly and really confusing. And here's the kicker. I don't think we even make pages anymore. Information architects aren't just organizing pages. We make canvases into which bits of content and bits of functionality and bits of experience flow. And it's that sort of disintegration of content, the fragmentation of our capabilities as UX designers, that means, I think, we've all inherited more responsibility for information architecture. Any arrangement of parts creates an information architecture. And as we create these fragmented ecosystems, these touch points where journeys can flow around and in between, we've got a much more challenging task when we start to consider the information architecture. I think thinking about that history of thinking about physical things created that clear pattern of putting things in places. A lot of IA was sort of focused on separation. We created coherence by separating things that were different and that grouped things that were similar. But for me, information architecture is the science of separation and the art of connection. If we just focus on separation, then we miss opportunities. We miss the gaps that we create through that separation. And we miss opportunities to create coherence and efficiency and resilience because we're so focused on the separation rather than the connection. So for the last few years, I've been trying to come up with ways of thinking about how we can pay more attention to the gaps and the loose joins that might bridge them. A few years ago, I started talking about ladders and climbing walls, because ladders remind me of that simple web structure that we've built in the past. Ladders are brilliant. Don't get me wrong, I like them sometimes. They move you up and down with precision and efficiency. But when I was younger, there's a moment of near terror when I had to step from the ladder onto the thing that the ladder was resting on. There's a moment of ultimate jeopardy when it feels as though your center of gravity rests absolutely nowhere. It's a moment of doubt and fear. And I think when we create gaps in our information architecture, in our experiences for users, we give them similar moments of doubt and fear. Some of the websites and ecosystems feel like ladders leaning up against tree-like structures or 21st century towers of Babel. Moving between them is fraught with doubt and questions. I don't think that's like a satisfying experience that we can give to users. So I started talking about climbing walls, because climbing walls sort of reward you to look sideways and move sideways. You can still pack them with loads of information. You can still give users some support in that exploration, and it encourages them to move in different directions. And that's obviously a metaphor. So to turn that into something practical, we've been using some of the principles of domain modeling and domain-driven design, so that rather than just building hierarchies and kind of synthesizing all our insight into sort of tree-like structures, we're much more likely to build graphs or webs or networks of relationships. This is a model that we use to describe some of our sport content, I suppose, but we're not describing or curating the content at this stage. We're curating the context. It's an Olympics year, so if we think about specifically, this is an example from the 2012 Olympics, I think. And we've modeled like the sports, the relationship between the sports people and the teams and the events. We're describing the classification that, we're not just describing the classification, we're describing like the logic that underpins that classification and sort of making all our knowledge that we would flow into an abstract model. We're sharing that, we're making it visible. And that means that when it comes to building actual digital products and services, because we've curated the context rather than just curating the content, the content sort of takes care of itself. And we've used this in a variety of ways. We've used this for dynamic semantic publishing, so that because we've understood the world, now when we create content, we can tag it with that understanding of the world. It gave us like loads of free aggregations of pages. When we create a story about a particular athlete, that story can appear on the event page, the athlete page, the venue page. We can have updates for the weather at a venue because we know what a venue is and the time of the event. So that's great, but our power extends beyond pages. Now we understand the real world, and we can deliver notifications about a sport. We're no longer just thinking in terms of pages, we're thinking about entire ecosystems of experiences and the journeys that might flow around and between that. And we use the same model for the 2012 Olympics and the 2016 Olympics. So it gives us greater efficiency and resilience. We understand the world, and the world doesn't change that often in the world of sport. They've got rules and stuff. But we still face an inevitable challenge. There are always spaces between the places we make. One of my biggest challenges is trying to sort of I suppose, deliver the most value for our audience. We've got no problem making pages. With 1,500 URLs every day, we've got lots of content. The challenge is getting the right content to the right member of the audience, building those connections and the loose joins. When we model a context, we draw a box around it. We create a bound context. That's necessary given the complexity of some of our domains. We've got 3 million pages just on our TV and radio content. So unless you limit the extent of your concern, you just can't deliver a model with an adequate level of detail or a useful model. So we draw a box around it and we work out the extent of our concern and just concentrate on that. And that's great. It allows us to make a thing. And it also enables lots of internal linking. But it probably makes discussion of external or cross-domain linking more difficult. Because you understand this tightly modeled domain, conversations of linking outside of that domain become more difficult. You probably can design like hooks in which like domains can interact, but bound contexts are really hard to link between. This is a graphic that our marketing and audiences team created. And it describes the links between some of our digital products. So each petal represents a different digital product that we create. So the red one might be BBC News, the yellow one might be BBC Sport. The little grey lines represent the links between the domains. Now we know that the content that we create for our news products concerns the same things that our learning and revision content for school children is about. And we know that the content that we've got in our food website could link to radio content elsewhere. We know that there are connections to be exploited, but we don't always manage to build those connections. So why not? It's because it's really difficult. Like we're trying to balance the connection and the separation that exists. We've got strategies to connect all our content. But because we follow that best practice of concentrating on a bound context, because we were fully committed to making the best thing, not necessarily the bigger thing that contains it, because we concentrate on projects which limit complexity and focus on deliverability, we have challenges in building those cross-domain links, those journeys that connect one thing to another. We're trying to overcome that with continuous delivery and working across teams, but it's really difficult. Things can either grow together or apart. And even if you don't believe that, then things do grow over time. And as they grow, they accrue a sort of gravity. I once joked that this was sort of dark matter and that we needed to engage in a process of generic domain-driven design, sort of considering the dark stuff in between the tightly modeled domains so that we could link between them. Because I think when that invisible stuff remains dark matter, when it's invisible and ill understood and unused, we're missing opportunities. I think we need to think differently. We should focus on a culture of connection. I think that ideal web is a series of small things loosely joined. But it's much easier to think about the things because they tend to be more tangible and more visible. And thinking about invisible things is really hard, like assumptions and connections and the associations that would lead to more coherent experiences. That is tricky. We need to do it, though. We need to consider the invisible forces and the joins. And I know that sounds just like, good UX. I think it probably is. But I was looking for a model to try and describe the sort of philosophy of that design. I love making models. Whether I use language or post-it notes or pens or pencils, I think that's where I'm most useful. So I thought about that, and I might have got one. I thought about the planets in the sky. They're a bit like the digital places we create. Each planet is a self-contained ecosystem. Have you ever made one of those models of the solar system, those like little painted planets held on little plastic spindly arms that sort of give jerky motion to orbits that rip real planets apart? I thought about that. I thought about explaining to people that that's what basically we're creating. We're creating these ecosystems, and gravity affects our users' ability to explore and move around them. Gravity can trap you, but it can also secure you. It's an invisible influence that we should probably consider as we design the digital spaces that our users and audience explore. I was pretty happy with myself. And then I saw this video, and I thought I should probably think about time as well, because those static, spindly arms are only telling half the story. I think the movement through time is just as important as the movement through space. And we need to consider the two together, because that will give us a more complete and accurate idea of the experiences that we're actually giving to users. And if it's more accurate, we can be more intentional in our use of that understanding. I architect spaces in which experiences happen in time. I architect spaces which evolve through time. I should think about time. So 20 minutes in, let's have a recap. Things and places, they're really complicated. IA isn't just organizing stuff, but the arrangement of any parts affects the experience, and I prefer climbing walls to ladders. And there's a temptation to think about things. They can hypnotize you. Thinking about invisible stuff is really hard, but we need to do it. Gravity is a weak and invisible force, but it exerts a profound influence. Time, you probably can't see, but you can witness its effects. It's invisible, and thinking about invisible things is really tricky. So I've given you some stories and some evidence and some metaphors to help you to be convinced of this need for a culture of connection and to think about the invisible stuff. Next, I'm going to talk about communication and how communication is at the heart of making those invisible things more understandable. And then I'll move on to talking about time. So, there is always a bigger context. But I think we do get hypnotized on those tangible things, the visible things, and we sometimes forget to consider the stuff between the pages, the invisible stuff. I think that's the stuff that breaks experiences most of the time, though. It's probably not the stuff that the user necessarily cares about, because it probably should feel invisible to them as well. But it's the stuff that makes our design intentional. It enables us to deliver the experience that we intend. Invisible stuff is all over the place in UX, like assumptions and dependencies and just the connections that are possible. So I'm going to talk about flow diagrams. But the important thing is probably, it's not the diagram that matters, it's the process that we go through as we create that diagram. But first, I want to tell you why I like fish. I like the shape. Because I think it describes the process that we go through as we create designs. It's probably just a version of the double diamond design process, but I think it describes what a good information architect should do throughout a project. They should sort of be propelled by their current understanding, and then they should diverge and converge, helping to describe and build a shared ubiquitous language amongst the team, and then help shape decisions. If it was this presentation was really bad, I would say you go fishing for insights. But it's a much better, yeah, thanks. That's not one of the jokes. It just occurred to me. But this is like the process of fishing for insights you can do via flow diagrams. All we're doing is sort of getting down our initial assumptions to start off with. This is not my work, it's the work of Barry Briggs, one of the members of my team. And he's great at just doing this, at taking the risk at the first stage of a project to document assumptions. And he isn't afraid of like the current understanding in the team not being very accurate. We just start with assumptions and then we build fidelity into it. And a great feature of this is that like most of the projects that I work on involve lots and lots of stakeholders, and that involves lots of conversations. And the ability to create a document that everyone can share means that we can have conversations concurrently. You don't have to get everyone in the same room at one time, because this document creates a virtual space. It's like an act of placemaking, because everyone in the team can occupy this document and shape it together. We go through iterations of this, building up fidelity, building up our understanding as we engage with different stakeholders that have responsibility for different sections. And so over the course of a project, we build up more understanding and more fidelity into the diagram. We can identify and expand areas that need more understanding. We can identify stakeholders and ask them to focus on a particular area or help with our understanding of it. We iterate, validate, and distribute as we work through a project. It enables us to kind of flag areas that we don't really know where the service works. It reveals complexity. So for things that need clarification, we can put a big green thing on that says, this needs clarification. Similarly, where we've got integration points that where otherwise we would just be assuming things, we call out that dependency so that we can go and talk to the people responsible for that. We've used this to kind of zoom out and show an entire system overall. We've used it to illustrate the flow of users through a service or system. We've also used it to illustrate the flow of data through a system so that we can talk to different stakeholders and different disciplines. We've used this with engineers and with developers and with technical architects. And it's really important that you kind of undertake this process with a multidisciplinary team. And that's sort of based on the principles of domain-driven design, like a model of something, thinking in an abstract sense about something. You can represent more or less anything in a level of abstraction. This allows us to take that level of abstraction to a level where anyone can sort of understand how the system overall works. And so it can close the gap between everyone's assumed version of the system to the actual system in the end. And so every jump up fidelity becomes closer because everyone's working on the same set of assumptions. I think this is particularly relevant now. I think we're living in an age where we need to think like information architects. But then maybe we always have. 4,000 years ago, during the construction of the pyramids, there was a point at which the interrelationship between the elements concerned in the construction of the pyramids kind of far surpassed the number of elements. Pyramids were no longer just simple burial sites. They had to be symbols of political and religious power. They had to be secure repositories for godlike rulers and their wealth. They were significant kind of religious challenges, engineering challenges, and each demand of itself would have surpassed the ability of the builders and the engineers. So architects came along. They understood the requirements and documented and helped shape decisions around the construction of the pyramids. Which reminds me of my fish. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a creature called a babelfish. It's described like this. The babelfish is small, yellow, leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy, absorbing all unconscious frequencies and then excreting telepathically a matrix formed from the conscious frequencies and nerve signals picked up by the speech centers of the brain. The practical upshot of which is if you stick one in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. Now, while I'm not so keen on being described as the oddest thing in the universe, I like the sound of the other stuff. I think information architects and UX designers are not too dissimilar to that Babelfish. We engage in a process of artful synthesizing. And creating diagrams is one way that we can do that. It's not necessarily the diagram that counts, though. It's the idea conveyed. It's the shared, ubiquitous language that you build in a team as you construct this diagram. Eric Evans, in his book on domain-driven design, says that a domain model isn't a diagram, it's the rigorously organized and selective abstraction. So that it's not the diagram or the code that you've created or an English sentence or the understanding of the team. It can be all of those things. It's the result of that artful synthesis, the creating of shared and shareable meaning. Creating this diagram or creating a shared understanding is just another act of placemaking that UX designers can engage in. It's creating somewhere where a team can occupy together and share an understanding. And by creating that shared understanding, we create more certainty and confidence and commitment that we're all moving in the same direction. We're sharing a common purpose and we're all creating the same intentional design or architecture. When we are one people, when we have one language, and this is only the beginning of what we can do. So we're into the final section, and I'm going to talk about trajectories, which are really just some wiggly lines, but trajectory sounds more impressive. And I've talked about flow diagrams that describe sort of the structure of a system or service, using sort of boxes and arrows. And now I'm going to talk about wiggly lines that are used to represent the subjective experience through that structure. There's a good reason why we use wiggly lines. If you compare the sort of, I suppose, other forms of storytelling, I sometimes find that, like in comic strips, the interesting point in a story is sometimes a bit in between the action. It's like the motivation or the intent. We want to create experiences with high degrees of internal coherence and consistency. So we found just using a continuous straight line stresses that, because it's a continuous line. The clue's in the name. Lines help you focus on every moment in an experience. And they're really like cheap and easy to make. Anyone can like grab a pen and draw a wiggly line. One of my favorite kinds of stories is lines is a narrative arc, because they allow you to kind of reflect and synthesize knowledge. Like we've heard out, I think Cornelius talked about like the effectiveness of stories. Stories just like bake insight into people's brains. They're really hard to reject. If you haven't read it, then I'd recommend like this book. It's a good introduction to using stories and narrative in UX design. It kind of, if you map your experiences to a narrative arc, then you kind of can exploit some of the physics of storytelling, and that helps you to make sense of it. But we found that actually drawing a line to represent that story is really important. That creation of a tangible artifact allows people to like hook their memory of the story onto a thing. The fact that it's really abstract increases the responsibility to dig into what that story might mean, but the line, the actual physical thing, gives you a thing to hook kind of commitment onto. So how do we do it? Well, the first type of trajectory that I'm going to talk about is the canonical trajectory. Now, trajectories was a thing that was introduced to me by Steve Benford, who's an academic at Nottingham University in the UK. And he calls it the canonical trajectory. I call it the design trajectory, because trajectory is hard enough to say on its own, let alone stick canonical at the start of it. But the idea of this one is that it's kind of describing the happy path of an experience. And it's just a line that flows from left to right. And it's got two axes. The x-axis represents time, so all experiences happen in time. And then the y-axis we've used for a number of things. We've used it to describe engagement or comprehension. I've even played with using like the thickness of the line to represent the number of choices a user might have at any stage in an experience. In Donna's book, she talks about how you can use narrative arcs for gap analysis and SWOT analysis, which is another idea that you can use as you're considering this. To give you an example of this, I'll use this talk as an example. So I started the design of this talk in much the same way, just by having ideas, just by like throwing post-it notes on a wall, because that's what designers do. And then as more ideas emerged, I started to have a sense of the sort of the structure, the experience that I wanted to give people. I came up with my 3 jokes, and then I focused on the sort of the strategies for maintaining engagement. And this is where the trajectories work really came into its own. It's sort of an intuitive heuristic, telling a story of the experience of the audience in the talk allows me to be user-centered. And then I'd abstract those ideas and I start to place them in the sense of a narrative arc. So I take each section and then I consider that canonical trajectory, the design trajectory. I try to understand the areas where attention might be waning or where there's a complex idea and I might need to take longer on it. And then I start to think about the actual experience of the user and whether your experience is falling within this designed trajectory. I start to think about, are people going to work out where they are? Are they going to enjoy it? And that brings me to my second type of trajectory, the participant trajectory. And this describes the actual experience. So you have as many of these as you have people experiencing your design. They're a lot thinner, but you can plot these against the canonical trajectory. Imagine this in game design, where you start to plot people's journeys through the path that you've designed and start to consider that if they wandered off that designed path, what are your design interventions for pulling them back into having the experience that you intended? It also enables you to explore a range of experiences within the same information architecture or designed service. So we've got an iPlayer radio app, and the experience of an advanced super user from the average user is very different. By mapping those experiences together across a single or a number of trajectories allows us to interrogate what are we doing a good job for both of those users, just given the same sort of inspiration, the same information architecture. We've also used participant trajectories in co-design sessions and design research, getting people to explain their real-world behaviors now and then mapping on digital experiences on top of those. We've used them to consider the experience of editors in the BBC who are working on online production systems, kind of mapping them across the systems that they need to use to create a piece of content. And we can start with really low fidelity versions of this, just literally just a pen and drawing a line, and then work them up into higher fidelity versions. This is, again, not my work. It's the work of another member of my team, Louisa. And I've got a confession here. This isn't actually a BBC project. Louisa showed me this in an interview. And I was like, oh, you're doing trajectories. And she went, nah, what? So it's not necessarily new ideas, but it's just a way of visually representing the flow of a user through a system. And here she's demonstrated the number of jumps between different programs, the jarring seams between different systems, and how that might compromise the flow of the experience. It enables us to sort of identify points where we can compare the design trajectory and the actual trajectory, and then design interventions to pull people back onto that happy path that we want. So I've talked a bit about wiggly lines. There's no one in this room that's going to deny that wiggly lines are cool. But I just spent a minute talking about the awesome power of dots. Because alongside trajectories, we've also been considering transitions. These are specific points in an experience. So that line expresses the continuity in an experience. But we know there are points, like that moment on a ladder when you're stepping from one domain to another or switching your perspective, where the continuity of an actual experience is at risk. Focusing on these moments is really valuable as a UX designer. They're moments of risk and reward for us. So we've been kind of constructing a control vocabulary of these types of moments that we can work down to consider the points at which our experience might fall down. We've thought about beginnings and roles and interface and different sessions. One tangible example of this is we've considered how when you're watching something on a video on demand service, you might interrupt your session. You might be commuting, or you might just have something else to do halfway through an episode. So we've introduced this feature to resume something that you were watching halfway through. Just by focusing on that point, that opportunity to create more coherence in an experience enables us to be more intentional, to exploit a moment that might be a weakness and to turn it into a strength. So back to trajectories, there are two more, and luckily the third one is that my get out of jail card for being 40 minutes into a 45-minute talk and still having 18 minutes worth of content. And that is the historical trajectory, because experiences create artifacts. Whether they're like physical artifacts or artifacts of memory, every time you have an experience, it creates something for the user. One example of this might be at the theme park when you're riding a roller coaster and you get off the roller coaster and then you see the picture of you screaming into the wind. That's a historical trajectory. It's a story of the actual experience that you can carry forward. In the digital world, you might consider a social share or a tweet or a retweet to be a virtual artifact that's come out of an experience. By thinking about the artifacts that your designed experiences create, you can reach into the future and try and shape it. We did some work in our knowledge and learning product, and we thought about a segment of the audience that we call smartly bored. These were people that were just looking for like a valuable experience, but were probably just doing that on their phones. And we considered how we might be able to use the historical trajectories created by other people's experience to grab their attention and pull them into having experiences of their own. Now, I've only got 4 minutes left now. So I created a historical trajectory about trajectories, because I love stuff that's meta. So there'll be a link on the last slide to a booklet that really explains what trajectories are about and has all of those transitions in so that you can actually learn the theory behind it. The last trajectory that I want to talk about is so what I've been calling predicted trajectories. Because I think when we engage in a project as UX designers, we bake assumptions into our design. We pour loads of knowledge into the design, and it's sort of built on foundations. And sometimes then we walk away, and the foundations, the knowledge is sort of lost. I think most design projects are really experiments. We start them with a question that normally starts with the words, how might we? And then we play with constraints and opportunities until we hit a solution that satisfies us and delights our audience. But problems don't stand still long enough to solve them all the time. And situations evolve and change. And I think by explaining the assumptions, the direction that you wanted a design to go in, you can be more intentional in it. When I used to work at an agency, I'd work on sort of content management system websites. And I'd bake all these assumptions into the design. They'd tell me that they're going to create 40 blog posts every month. And then you come back in like a year's time, and it would just be full of all the content that you migrated from their last content management system. I think creating a predicted trajectory, describing that scenario to a client, enables them to understand when your design isn't going to work, or points at which you might be able to re-engage with them. One version of this might be future cones coming full circle on the day. I think a way of describing the future that you intended for your design enables you to be more intentional, to be a better user experience designer, because you can take more responsibility for not only the design that you deliver, but the way that that design is going to evolve into the future. So come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Now, scratch that. I don't think cities and towers are the way forward. I think we should probably concentrate on making names, words with shared and shareable meaning. And we should probably think about stories as well. Stories can survive. That story of the Tower of Babel has survived. Stories are the artful making of sense that we've engaged in since we lived in caves. They're the way that we can communicate and build consensus, build a shared understanding and ubiquitous language. Today I've told some stories about space and gravity and climbing walls and fish. I've talked about gaps and invisible stuff. I've described how information architecture is more than just organizing things. It's about building connections. It's more than just the structure that your experiences contain. It's also the experiences. The theme of this conference is tomorrow, today. I think if we can shape the language and the story of the future that we want to create for our audiences, then we can exert more influence and be more intentional in our design of that future. We can close the gap between now and the future we want. So that's my talk. I'm the last speaker of today, but hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.